children, Jack and Lilly, vanished without a trace on a quiet morning. No noise, no struggle, just silence. What really happened in those missing moments? In today's update, we break down the timeline, the witness account, and the disturbing questions still unanswered. If you care about truth and real-time updates on this case, hit subscribe and help us reach 5,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more. Also, drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching from? Your voice matters, and together we keep this story alive until answers are found. On a tense and complex case involving the disappearance of two children, Jack and Lilly, one phone call has emerged as a critical window into manipulation, false narratives, and psychological strategy. The call, involving Derwood, Sonny, and references to Daniel, demonstrates how storytelling, selective truth, and dramatic emphasis can be used to influence perceptions while avoiding accountability. During the call, Derwood repeatedly claims he intends to confront Daniel about alleged involvement in the events surrounding Jack and Lilly's disappearance. He presents the scenario with urgency and detail, that he had initially attempted to call Daniel but misdialed, and that upon completion of his conversation with Sonny, he would immediately contact Daniel to challenge him. On the surface, this creates the impression that Derwood is taking action, standing up for truth, and actively pursuing the resolution of the case. However, the call reveals more than intention. It exposes the strategic manipulation of the listener. By claiming impending action, Derwood seeks to establish credibility and assert moral alignment, implying that his previous statements regarding Daniel's involvement are factual. The tactic hinges on the listener's assumption that someone making such claims and promising action must be truthful. It is a classic form of psychological manipulation known as intent as proof, where asserting future action is used to validate past statements without providing actual evidence. The narrative is reinforced by selective truth disclosure. Derwood references Daniel's anger issues, known to those familiar with the case, including Sonny. By embedding this factual detail, he strengthens the plausibility of his claims. These truth nuggets function to lend authenticity to an otherwise fabricated story. Inserting verifiable elements amidst a network of falsehoods increases believability and encourages the listener to accept the broader narrative at face value. Throughout the conversation, Derwood demonstrates a heightened, almost eager tone. Analysis of his speech patterns, tempo, and inflection indicates artificial enthusiasm, a common sign of deception. Reporters and psychologists recognize that manipulators often overcompensate when crafting narratives, projecting intensity and urgency to mask the lack of factual substance. The urgency is not necessarily intended to convey moral responsibility, but rather to impress upon the listener that the story is real. Central to the call is the discussion of Daniel, a figure depicted as volatile and capable of confrontation. Derwood anticipates that Daniel will react strongly if confronted, embedding this prediction within his narrative. This functions on multiple levels. First, it demonstrates awareness of Daniel's temperament, which is partially truthful. Second, it positions Derwood as an informed intermediary, someone capable of managing a potentially dangerous situation. Third, it uses the predicted behavior of another party to lend credibility to Derwood's own planned actions, even though those actions were never intended to occur. By presenting his narrative in this manner, Derwood creates a psychological safety net. Sonny, positioned as the listener, becomes an unwitting witness. The call is structured to allow Derwood to later reference it as evidence of diligence, moral responsibility, and allegiance to truth. The listener's presence and potential silence provide an additional layer of security, allowing him to claim transparency without actually providing substantive proof. The conversation also reveals manipulation through dramatic exaggeration. Derwood repeatedly emphasizes the severity of the situation: helicopters searching in water up to the waist, intense effort, and shouted warnings. While these elements evoke urgency and gravity, they also serve to dramatize his role and elevate the perceived seriousness of his claims. The inclusion of such details is not accidental. Why, it is a deliberate effort to convey authenticity and moral commitment. A further dimension of the manipulation involves highlighting the involvement of other figures. Derwood references interactions with additional parties, hinting that multiple individuals are implicated in some form of oversight or wrongdoing. By suggesting corroboration or shared knowledge, he attempts to build an internal validation for his story. This strategy exploits the listener's assumption that complex, multi-person narratives are inherently more credible than isolated claims. Within the call, there is repeated use of conditional language and plans that are never enacted. The promise to confront Daniel serves as a performance of responsibility, projecting an image of accountability without actual follow-through. Analysts describe this as a form of illusory action, where a speaker creates the perception of initiative while maintaining complete control over whether the action occurs. The listener is led to assume participation in a morally correct process, reinforcing trust in the speaker. Psychological cues extend to the insertion of plausible reasoning for anticipated outcomes. Derwood predicts that Daniel will react negatively when confronted. This prediction aligns with observable behaviors documented in other sources, including text messages, messages from Malaya, and prior documented events. By weaving this plausible outcome into his narrative, Derwood further enhances his perceived legitimacy. Listeners are conditioned to believe that familiarity with another's temperament equates to truthfulness in interpretation. Well, the strategy also incorporates the careful framing of responsibility. Derwood positions himself as both advocate and investigator, claiming proactive efforts to uncover facts while simultaneously deflecting accountability. This dual positioning strengthens the perception of moral high ground. In essence, he portrays himself as a mediator between chaos and clarity, while the narrative subtly shields him from scrutiny. The conversation reveals a conscious effort to blend minor truths with fabricated elements. By anchoring the story with Daniel's known anger issues, prior interactions, and involvement with child protection services, Derwood crafts a layered narrative. Observers are more likely to accept the fabricated components because they are enveloped in verified information. This technique is widely recognized in investigative psychology as a key indicator of strategic deception. Additionally, the call functions as a mechanism of obstruction. While outwardly presenting itself as investigative and moral, the conversation ensures that no concrete evidence or verifiable records are generated. Derwood carefully avoids producing documents, receipts, or records that could validate his claims, maintaining full control over the narrative. The absence of proof is masked by the confident, urgent tone, which encourages acceptance based on perceived initiative rather than facts. The case further illustrates audience targeting. Sunny is selected as the recipient of these claims precisely because she is likely to remain discreet. By choosing a listener who is credible yet unlikely to act publicly, Derwood ensures that his narrative can be transmitted without immediate challenge. This choice of audience underscores a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and psychological leverage. Observers note a pattern of performance-driven communication. Derwood consistently conveys intensity, concern, and moral authority, creating the impression of transparency and commitment. These performative elements are synchronized with selective truth-telling, dramatic context, and predicted responses from others to construct a compelling, yet ultimately deceptive narrative. The call also demonstrates manipulation through temporal framing. By referencing prior events and promising imminent action, Derwood creates a sense of continuity and accountability. The listener perceives a timeline of intervention, we're further reinforcing the perception that the speaker is active, responsible, and morally aligned. The reality, however, is that these actions remain entirely theoretical. Analysis of the call highlights another layer: strategic self-protection. Derwood crafts the conversation to serve as an alibi against potential investigation by authorities. By inserting partial truths, demonstrating awareness of key players' behavior, and projecting forthcoming action, he constructs a defensible narrative. This approach allows him to claim credibility while retaining complete control over factual outcomes. Moreover, Derwood's narrative includes the illusion of impartiality. He positions himself as someone seeking truth, confronting Daniel to verify claims and clarifying inconsistencies. In doing so, he implicitly encourages the listener to trust his judgment and interpret his role as neutral and fact-driven. In reality, the narrative serves to protect his own interests, advance particular interpretations, and reinforce loyalty to Daniel. The phone call illustrates the broader theme of psychological manipulation in crisis situations. By combining selective truth, dramatic emphasis, predicted responses, audience targeting, and illusionary action, Derwood creates a narrative that appears authentic to an uninformed listener. This technique exploits natural human tendencies to trust urgency, perceived effort, and partial verification. Observers also note the role of tone and vocal cues. The speaker's rapid tempo, elevated energy, and confident delivery all contribute to the perception of truthfulness. Research in communication psychology supports the idea that speakers who convey passion and certainty are more likely to be believed, even when the underlying claims lack verifiable support. Throughout the call, there is a careful layering of contextual details. References to past investigations, child protection involvement, and interactions between key players create the impression of intimate knowledge. This not only enhances the credibility of Derwood's claims, but also positions him as deeply embedded in the narrative, capable of guiding the listener through the events. Despite these efforts, analytical review reveals critical inconsistencies. Claims of confronting Daniel, orchestrating investigations, and pursuing truth are not substantiated. The listener is asked to accept verbal promises as evidence, which constitutes the core of the manipulation strategy. These inconsistencies, when cross-referenced with independent records and documented events, expose the narrative as primarily performative. The conversation further exemplifies strategic ambiguity. Derwood carefully avoids specifying verifiable details, instead relying on broad, dramatic descriptions. This ambiguity prevents scrutiny, allowing the narrative to adapt to multiple interpretations while appearing precise and authoritative. Listeners are encouraged to fill in gaps with assumptions, often aligning with the speaker's intended framing. In addition, the conversation demonstrates reinforcement through repetition. Key claims are restated, dramatic stakes are reiterated, and the supposed sequence of events is narrated multiple times. Now, this repetition strengthens the perception of authenticity by creating a cognitive bias in the listener. Hearing a story multiple times increases belief in its truth. The cumulative effect of these tactics is significant. To an observer, the call presents a coherent, morally aligned, and factually grounded narrative. To an analyst, it exposes complex deception, strategic audience manipulation, and protective self-framing. The case illustrates the subtle interplay between truth, partial truth, and fabrication in real-world crisis communications. Ultimately, the call exemplifies a sophisticated use of psychological leverage, selective disclosure, and narrative control. It highlights how an individual can craft an appearance of moral and investigative diligence while simultaneously advancing personal interests and deflecting scrutiny. See, observers are reminded that credibility can be manufactured through a combination of style, partial fact, and audience selection, rather than through verifiable action. In reviewing the details, it becomes clear that the conversation's structure, tone, and content were designed to project moral alignment and investigative diligence, influence the listener's perception of truth, provide a defensive alibi for future scrutiny, protect other involved parties while managing risk, exploit known psychological tendencies in the audience. The Jack and Lilly case remains unresolved in critical areas, And this call provides insight not only into the dynamics between Derwood, Daniel, and Sunny, but also into broader patterns of manipulation that can arise in high-stakes situations. The strategic use of partial truths, dramatic narrative, and impromised action creates a compelling but ultimately deceptive portrait that continues to influence public perception and investigative approaches. As the investigation progresses, analysts, investigators, and observers alike must consider the subtle interplay of narrative, manipulation, and psychological influence. The phone call demonstrates how even highly charged, emotionally intense communications can be used strategically to shape belief, establish credibility, and protect personal interests. Understanding these patterns is essential for interpreting statements, verifying claims, and navigating complex cases where truth and perception are carefully interwoven.